Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hillary. Now, regular listeners to this podcast will know that I co-present the show with industry analyst Peter Ryan of Ryan Strategic Advisory. Peter's company is presenting their big annual survey today, so in this episode of CX Files, I'll be talking to Peter about the results of the Ryan Strategic Advisory Front Office BPO Omnibus Survey 2021. This research asks hundreds of decision makers in the CX and BPO industry about their preferred locations to work with, in addition to several other CX trends. In the podcast, we mainly focus on the locations, but as Peter explains at the end, there is a whole lot more in the research, especially some new research into work from home attitudes and trends. You can visit ryanadvisory.com to access the full report. Okay, Peter, so it's the 8th of April when this podcast is going out, and this is also the date that you're revealing the Front Office BPO survey results for 2021. So instead of going through a long, drawn-out countdown, why don't we just go straight to the top and talk about who's won this year?
Thanks, Mark, and it's great to be back as a guest on the CX Files podcast, turning the tables once again on me, keeping things interesting. And things were definitely interesting from the perspective of the 2021 Front Office BPO Omnibus survey in regards to the most favored offshore locations. Now, keep in mind that we ask a whole series of questions to the 628 respondents from North America, Western Europe, and Australia. One of them is location favorability for offshore and nearshore destinations. I'm able to reveal today, Mark, simultaneously with the webinar that we're doing right now, live with Mark Angus and the team from CX Outsourcers and Knowledge Executive, that after 3 years in second place, South Africa has achieved the top spot for 2021 in terms of being the most favored offshore destination for customer experience management.
That's great. I mean, I'm sure the guys down in South Africa are all going to be happy to hear that. But it's interesting that in all the years you've been doing the survey, there's been a different number one each year. So is there something that South Africa needs to do to try and keep themselves there at the top? And I know, personally from visiting there several times that they have a very strong focus on the jobs in the industry. We've traditionally seen very large contact centers creating a lot of jobs. And this industry is changing somewhat. We're seeing a lot more automation, a lot more use of bots. So I don't necessarily think we will be able to focus on those warehouses full of agents forever. Is that something that you think might impact their strategy there?
First off, let me concur with you and associate myself with your comments, congratulating the stakeholders in South Africa, the industry association members, the individuals, the entrepreneurs who have set themselves up over the past 2 decades to handle international interactions. And I think it's a great validation for the work that they've done. But you raise a very interesting point. We have seen over the course of the past few years a different number one each year. We'll remember in 2019 when we were assembled at CX Outsourcers in Windsor, and we did the reveal of the top most favored locations. Then it was the Philippines. Last year, India took the top spot, South Africa this year. And I think that what you're pointing to in terms of South Africa's requirement in order to maintain this level of favorability is going to be very much focused on evolving and making sure that the CX value proposition is answering the needs of enterprise buyers, whether they're in Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, or any other destination that uses South Africa to a large degree for CX needs. And I think that your point is very well taken when it comes to how the industry is evolving from a labor force standpoint. Let's be perfectly frank. The number of roles that are being pushed towards smart automation powered by artificial intelligence solutions, it's becoming very, very, very significant in terms of where we are now, but it's going to be even more significant moving forward. And the call center farms, the huge volumes of individuals that have traditionally worked in contact centers, whether it's in South Africa or anywhere else, are probably going to be a thing of the past. When we look at prognosticating how the industry is going to be 5 years from now. the pressure is going to be on as of today for South Africa to make sure that its value proposition is evolving in the right direction, taking into account great quality labor, absolutely, but great quality labor that is complemented by the right technology solutions to make sure that the customer experience is better and to make sure that the agent experience is better too.
Okay, cool. Well, South Africa's number one, but who else was in the top 5 this year then?
So number 2 went to India. Effectively, it came runner-up, traded spots with South Africa. And I would say it was also a very strong number 2. There's no question in my mind that the level of favorability towards India as an offshore destination has really been maintained. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that providers that are based in India have done a fantastic job promoting that location as an ideal destination in which both voice work, but as well as non-voice work and some of the back office work around perhaps processing alongside digital interactions. It's definitely, I think, moved into that second spot or really maintained that level of favorability and interest because of the fact that their value proposition has evolved in terms of where consumers are going and what the enterprise needs are to service those consumers. We're also looking, Mark, at a 3-way tie in regards to third place. Interestingly enough, we saw effectively a statistical tie between the Philippines, which maintained its third place positioning from last year. Malaysia moves up 1 from 4th place into 3rd place. And Poland had a very big jump from 5th place into 3rd place as well for that 3-way tie. In 4th place this year, it was interesting to see a monster comeback by Egypt. Now, Egypt, you'll recall, in 2020 fell out of the top 5. It had placed in the top 5 in 2019, but it makes a triumphant return to the top 5 in 2021. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that there's been a significant amount of promotion that's being done by Egyptian stakeholders in the outsourcing and the CX industry, as well as by the government agency ITITA, which has worked seamlessly with the industry to make sure that the most salient and the most relevant aspects of Egyptian BPO and Egyptian CX have been brought to the forefront, whether it's using different digital channels, whether it's being done via promotion, albeit remotely these days. But the point is, it's actually made a big difference. And rounding out 5th place is a new entrant to the top 5, and that's Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, as we all know, has been a long-time destination, certainly from the standpoint of multilingual work. It wasn't just the enterprise respondents in the UK that gave Northern Ireland a big thumbs up this year, but it was a lot of continental European enterprise decision makers as well who saw Northern Ireland as a great location that can handle quality multilingual CX delivery.
Okay, that's great. Well, India has a really long heritage in BPO. I mean, I've been going out there for the last 2 decades looking at what's been going on there. So we probably don't need to focus on a strong second place very much. But what happened with that 3rd place tie then?
Well, I think there's a few things. Number one, if I'm honest with you, I do believe that in the case of the Philippines, perhaps some missteps in regards to how the government handled the pandemic situation initially last year have probably had a bit of a hangover. I mean, the fact is it's still in the top 5, but it has not reclaimed the number 1 posts that it held in 2018 and 2019. From the standpoint of Malaysia, I think Malaysia has always been a very strong nearshore destination for Australia, and the favorability from Australian respondents was quite strong again in 2021. I would also say that the heritage Malaysia has of serving other English language markets certainly helped it in regards to its level of favorability. But in Poland, it's a very interesting, Mark, what we did see was a huge amount of interest from decision makers in the United Kingdom. And that ties very closely in with the fact that UK enterprise contact center managers told us in the survey work that nearshore destination capacity and the ability to access nearshore locations is a very important decision factor when they were looking at how to work with a BPO. So definitely the correlation between that interest in the nearshore and Poland's level of favorability popped up. Notwithstanding for Poland, it was again quite popular in Germany as it was last year. And we added Italy to the survey this year. We had a number of respondents who are coming from Italy, and Poland had a very decent level of favorability amongst Italian CX decision makers as well.
Okay, and you mentioned Egypt there as well, getting that fourth place,
Yeah.
and that's interesting because it was about a decade ago, or just over a decade ago, when there was a great deal of attention placed on the growth and opportunity in Egypt, and obviously because of the politics around that time, it became difficult for a while. But it seems that they're really making a comeback now.
They're definitely making a comeback. Egypt 2.0 is a real thing. And one of the things that I recall when people like you and I, analysts like you and I, would make trips to Egypt to see what was happening between, say, 2004 and 2011, every time you would go out, there would be new investors. Every time you would go out, there would be new logos supported from Egypt. The infrastructure was improving. The focus on not just doing BPO, but quality BPO was very much the watchword in Egypt. And I think the key is, while there were some issues in terms of political stability over the course of several years following the events of the spring of 2011. What I would comment on is, as long as I was tracking the market, Egypt's CX industry never actually shrank. It didn't grow as fast as it was growing before pre-2011, but it never shrank. And I think that's key here. And that drives around quality, that drives around multilingualism, that drives around, I think, a very effective partnership between the government and the industry, in terms of the government responding to what the industry needs, but allowing the industry to set that agenda. And this is why we're seeing that focus around Egypt making, as I mentioned before, a monster comeback. Egypt is very much on the map when it comes to North America, when it comes to Western Europe, and when it comes to Australia.
Okay, and it's great to see Northern Ireland storming into the top five. Just this morning, I was listening to the Irish History podcast, so obviously it's of interest to me personally as well. But I think that it's interesting because it's still based within the UK. Will there be any competition as we see more work from home from other regions of the UK itself?
That's actually a really good question. And as you say, it's important, I think, from the standpoint, both you and I are holders of Irish passports in terms of our own interest personally and from a family perspective. That said, I do think that Northern Ireland has always been a very, very strong location when it comes to doing any type of contact center work. And I can recall when I lived in the Republic of Ireland about 20 years ago, one of the things that we were picking up on back then was the interest in using different cities, whether it was in the north of Ireland or in the Republic, as hubs, multilingual hubs, where you could find incredibly good infrastructure, where you could find great government incentives, and you were able, to a very large degree, to find individuals who spoke different languages to do pan-European support. That's not gone away. And I think that it speaks definitely to the interest that Northern Ireland brings to the table when it comes to not just British enterprises, but also enterprises that might be found in France or in Spain, in Italy, in Germany, or any other country. The reality is that there's been a tremendous amount of work in regards to building up that language infrastructure. So the way I see Northern Ireland is not just an English-only hub, whether it's being done work from home or done in a center, but I see it in taking into account that multilingualism that's been so important and that's been such a factor in driving both jobs and economic growth in the north of Ireland.
Okay, and just before we were recording, you mentioned about Africa in general, and several different African countries were actually performing very well, even though we've only got Egypt there in the top five from that region. What are the standouts that you noticed then? I mean, who's rising fast in Africa?
Probably there's a couple of standouts. I'll mention a couple of them right now. I was very impressed to see Senegal achieve the top spot for France in terms of our French respondent pool. Senegal was the most favored location in terms of CX delivery for French consumers, which frankly doesn't surprise me. I, along with our mutual friend Stephen Lloyd, had the chance to visit Senegal a couple of years ago and was blown out of the water by the tremendous amount of investment by outsourcers, as well as the quality of labor and the level of sophistication that the agents brought to the table. So to me, it's no surprise that we're seeing a lot of interest from France around Senegal. And I would dare say that we'll be starting to see that from French Canada, perhaps Belgium and French Switzerland as well in the very near future. Equally speaking, Zimbabwe had an incredibly good year, Mark. We saw that Zimbabwe was very much favored amongst British enterprise contact center decision makers, and to some degree in Canada as well. And this is quite something for a location that's got a very aggressive value proposition and, quite frankly, a very dynamic industry. But let's be perfectly frank, hasn't necessarily been on the broader offshore CX map. They're definitely making up for lost time. I'd also point out to another success story, and that's Rwanda. And Rwanda definitely performed quite well amongst a lot of different demand markets. We know that Rwanda has had a tremendous amount of infrastructure placed into, investment in the infrastructure. And there's also been a big emphasis around education, multilingual education. It's a bilingual country for all intents and purposes. And amongst both French language enterprise decision makers, as well as English language ones, Rwanda had a really, really great time.
Okay, that's great. Are there any other trends apart from the African ones that you've just noted that particularly came out across any other regions?
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting to note that I think outside of Africa, the countries we've listed in Africa, the other big success story that I would highlight would be Jamaica. Mark, it's interesting because we've been hearing a lot of buzz the past 3 or 4 months about Jamaica as an ideal location to balance out service delivery for the United Kingdom. And this definitely showed through this year in our survey. In fact, British enterprise decision makers from the contact center side of businesses told us that Jamaica was at such a level of favorability. It was in the top 10 for the UK, which we've never seen before, but it's great news for any Jamaican BPO stakeholder looking to try and make a rush of it in terms of serving British enterprises and thereby British consumers. There was also, I would say, more interest than I anticipated for 2 countries in the Middle East. We included Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates this year. Each of those countries, for first timers, I think performed incredibly well in terms of favorability amongst the respondents to our survey. And I think I'd also be remiss if I didn't call out Mexico. Mexico did not make the top 5, but it did certainly very, very well amongst enterprise decision makers from the standpoint of the United States as well as from Spain. So definitely some great regional success stories in regards to some of the different offshore and nearshore delivery points that we sounded out our respondents on.
All right, that's fantastic. Thanks for the summary. Where can listeners get hold of the full report then?
Well, if listeners would like to visit ryanadvisory.com, we will be highlighting where you can get the report. You can purchase it off the shelf. It's going to be approximately 110 pages. It's very thorough. It's not just offshoring we're looking at. We're sounding out the views of enterprise CX decision makers on elements such as work from home, such as CX technology, such as their own enterprise investment capacity, as well as what their priorities are, what are their pain points, and a whole host of other different themes and topics that I think will really set the stage for the rest of 2021.
Thanks for downloading the CX Files podcast. If you have a moment, please give us a star rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, because this really helps other people to find the podcast. If you have any suggestions for future guests, or ideas, people, or topics, then please just find myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan on LinkedIn and send a suggestion.